This is a special bonus mini episode of the Morning Scoop podcast for BuckeyeScoop.com. We are talking conference realignment today. It is one of the hot topics that everyone seems to want to hear more about. So I'm having our resident insider, Nevada Buck, on to talk about it. You know, he and I have talked a lot about the Big Ten potentially adding one or more Pac-12 teams to the league, but there are also some really appealing targets in the ACC as well. You know, Nevada, welcome. Every conversation we've had about adding ACC teams kind of hits a brick wall when we talk about the grant of rights issue. So can you briefly explain what that is and why some teams in the league think it might not necessarily be the deal breaker we've talked about after all?
The grant of rights in a very oversimplified form for any lawyers that are out there listening is basically it's a contract that you sign that says, I am pledging the broadcast rights of our entity to the league. And in the event that I leave the league or that there's some other change, my rights still stay with the league. That's basically the outline of that. And that contract, that grant of rights contract, runs through 2036, which, as you said, that's the next 15 years. So that's pretty much taken a lot of the ACC teams out of the discussions. However, there have been a couple of ACC teams that have been studying this, and they feel that there's a legal theory that the grant of rights is overly broad and therefore is not legally enforceable, and that could be broken. There'd be a financial penalty involved with breaking it, but that it's breakable. And those two schools are Virginia and North Carolina, which are two very, logical and attractive expansion candidates for the Big Ten for a lot of reasons. Their academic reputation, their sports reputation, their geographic location, their AAU membership. But the fact that those two are looking at it, this could be seismic because this could potentially send off a Clemson to the SEC. You think about that, and the whole ACC could be up for grabs if this grant of rights is able to be broken. And I think it can be, although it's ultimately going to come down to dollars and cents, as these things usually do. But I think the ACC teams could be in play, and that's a pretty new development.
Yeah, and I mean, you went into a little bit of the detail on why this might make sense from the Big Ten side. What might make those two schools kind of appealing to the Big Ten. But let's explain why this makes sense for the schools, though, because I mean, this is, you might say, well, it's North Carolina, and you have the historical rivalry with Duke, and North Carolina State, and this is their historical home, and here's the thing: the Big Ten distributed $54 million to each school from TV last year. The ACC distributed $33 million. I will do the math for you. That is $21 million per school less than the Big Ten last year and every year moving forward. And, I assume for those schools, the conversation about whether joining the Big Ten would be good for business doesn't have to go much beyond that. But here's the thing. It's $21 million a year difference now. There's a reason to think that the number could actually be getting bigger in the short term.
Well, I think there's no question it's going to get bigger. It's only a question of how high. I've heard numbers as high as $100 million a year. So if it's $100 million a year compared to the next 15 years getting $33 million in the ACC, you're talking about almost $750 million difference just over that period of time. So it's a pretty compelling reason for these schools to be looking at options like this. And I don't think those numbers are crazy. And I think that's the only reason that teams would make a move like this. But I think that's the order of magnitude that we're talking about here. It's huge. These are not small differences. These are huge differences. And that's why, schools are looking at, who ever thought that Oklahoma, the prevailing wisdom was that Oklahoma would never leave without Oklahoma State, that there were state laws against it, and that there was, there'd be rioting in the streets, and they could never leave. And look, they're gone. So, I think that the Duke, UNC, the UNC, NC State thing, there's lots of different ways that cat could get skinned. When you're talking about $750 million over the next decade and a half. So something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about that level of difference with $100 million for some schools and $33 million for others, you're not talking about a Power Five anymore. I mean, you would assume the SEC's new contract is probably somewhere in that same neighborhood as the Big Ten's. At that point, it's a Power Two. And then the drop off to the other conferences is like the drop off from the Power Five right now to like the Sun Belt and the CUSA and the MAC. I mean, it's like orders of magnitude different. And, at that point, you've got two super conferences, and then everyone else is just kind of like also playing the sport, but kind of at a different level, which is, I mean, it's crazy to think about, but it may not be quite as far off as people might think. Another ACC school that I keep wondering about is Georgia Tech. I mean, it's an excellent academic school. It's an AAU member. That's the Association of American Universities. It's a really prestigious group of universities. It's functionally a requirement for schools to join the Big Ten to be an AAU member. Georgia Tech is one. Virginia, North Carolina also members. Georgia Tech also located in one of the fastest growing cities, one of the fastest growing states in the United States. I mean, to you, is that a school the Big Ten would look at as well?
I think so. And I think, to kind of dovetail on your earlier point, I think the two super conferences is really the race. I mean, people would keep asking what's the ultimate number, but I think the ultimate number is probably 24. I think that's how big these conferences are going to be. And like you said, there's probably only going to be two of them. So at that point, are you adding to Georgia Tech? Are you adding to Duke? Who else comes with you from the ACC? Who else comes from the Pac-10? There's lots of different combinations, but Georgia Tech makes so much sense for so many different reasons, and people have long talked about them being a potential good target for the Big Ten, and I think with this new broadcast agreement coming down, that's certainly a school to keep a careful eye on for sure.